My name is Esther May Whitfield. I was born in the city of Dayton in the state of Ohio on the 3rd day of November in the year 1848. My father was Silas Whitfield, blacksmith by trade, drunkard by constitution. My mother was Clara Whitfield, born Clara Dennison, who died in childbirth when I was 6 years old, and whose face I can no longer picture with any certainty. I am 90 years old as I speak these words into this machine. It is the year 1938. I reside now in Albany, in the state of New York, where I have lived since 1901. I've outlived 2 husbands, 4 of my 6 children, and every person who ever witnessed my childhood. There is no one left to contradict me. There is no one left to confirm me. There is only this voice and this memory, and the fact that I have carried a hatred in my breast for more than 80 years. I hated my father. I do not say this with drama. I say it as I would say I was born in November, or that my eyes are brown, or that I never learned to swim. It is a fact of my existence. The hatred entered me slowly, night by night, blow by blow, and it settled there so completely that I cannot imagine who I would have been without it. He beat me with a leather belt every night for 15 years, from my 6th birthday until the morning I left his house at 21. I have counted them. I've had sufficient time to count. 5,475 nights, more or less, of anticipating the sound of his boots on the stair, of hearing the buckle clink as he unfastened it, of feeling the leather across my back, my legs, the soles of my feet when I tried to run. I never forgave him. I never spoke to him again after I left. He died in 1889, and I did not attend his funeral, though I knew the date, though I had the means to travel, though his sister wrote me 3 letters pleading for my presence. I'm not here to ask for understanding. I'm here to explain why. The belt, every night, until I escaped. Dayton in 1848 was a city of mud and ambition. The Miami Canal cutting through it like a promise, bringing grain and pork and people from the interior. My father had come there from Virginia in 1835, fleeing debts or a woman or the law. He never said, and I never asked. He set up his smithy on Water Street, shoeing horses for the canal boats and the farmers who came to market. When he was sober, which was perhaps 3 mornings a week, he was competent. His work held. When he was drunk, which was the remainder, he was merely present, sitting in the forge's heat, staring at the coals as if they owed him money. We lived in 2 rooms above the smithy. I remember the smell of burning hoof, the way it clung to my hair, my clothes, the thin mattress I shared with my mother until she died. I remember the sound of the bellows, the rhythmic hush and sigh that marked my father's working hours, and the silence that followed when he locked the shop and climbed the stairs with a bottle in his hand. I was 5 when I learned to distinguish between his footsteps. The heavy, uneven tread meant the belt would come that night. The lighter, quicker step meant he would fall asleep in his chair, and I would have until morning. My mother tried to protect me. She stood between us when she could. She died trying. I was 6 years old when they buried my mother. The ground was hard with November frost, and the men had to use picks to break the earth. I stood beside my father, wearing a black dress that had belonged to my cousin, its hem pinned up with rusted safety pins. I did not cry. I had learned already that crying provoked him. It was a sound he could not tolerate, like the whine of a dog or the squeak of an unoiled hinge. He struck me once for crying when I burned my hand on the stove. After that, I learned to make no sound at all. The beatings began in earnest after her death. Before, they had been irregular, driven by some specific failure, a spilled pail, a late meal, a word spoken at the wrong moment. After, they became systematic. I have thought about this for 80 years, and I believe he needed someone to punish for her leaving. She had escaped him in the only way available. I remained. He used a leather belt, 1.5 inches wide, with a brass buckle that he would sometimes remove to avoid breaking the skin. More often, he left it on. The belt had been his father's, he told me once, as if this heritage justified its use. He kept it hanging on a peg beside the door, and I would watch it as I moved through my chores, calculating whether tonight would bring the punishment or the reprieve. My days were structured around avoidance. I rose before dawn to light the fire and prepare his breakfast, usually corn mush and salt pork, sometimes bread if I had managed to trade for flour at the market. I cleaned the smithy, sorted the nails, kept the ledger of accounts he could not read when drunk. I went to school when I could, which was perhaps 3 days a week in winter, less in summer when he needed me to work. I learned to read, to write a fair hand, to calculate sums. These skills would later save me, though I did not know it then. The school was a single room on Ludlow Street, run by a Miss Harriet Bowen, who was 30 and unmarried and possessed of a patience I did not then understand. She never asked why I flinched when she raised her hand to write on the board. She never commented on the bruises visible at my wrists, though I caught her looking once, her mouth tightening before she turned away. In 1856, when I was 8, she gave me a book, The Pilgrim's Progress, which I hid beneath my mattress and read by the light of the forge's dying coals. I read it 17 times. I knew every word of Christian's journey, every trial, every temptation. I measured my own progress by his. The Slough of Despond was the smithy. The Valley of the Shadow was my father's bedroom. The Celestial City was anywhere else. The war came when I was 13. My father was too old to enlist, too drunk to be accepted, though he spoke often of going, of the bounty money, of escaping his creditors. Instead, the war came to us in the form of wounded men transported north on the canal, in the price of grain that doubled and then tripled, in the absence of young men from the streets. I remember the lists posted outside the courthouse, the black-bordered newspapers, the widows in their weeds who began to appear in church, though I was not permitted to attend. My father had no religion, only superstition. He would not enter a church, believing that God had marked him for punishment and would strike him down if he pretended otherwise. In 1862, when I was 14, a man named Thomas Aldridge began to court me. He was 32, a clerk in the freight office of the Canal Company, with a lame leg from a childhood accident and a face that showed the marks of smallpox. He was not unkind. He brought me licorice from the general store, and once a ribbon for my hair. My father encouraged the match. Aldridge had $60 in savings and no family to support. I understood even then that I was being sold. I did not resist. Marriage meant a door that locked from the inside, a bed I did not have to share with my father's memory. I said yes in March of 1863, and we were married by a justice of the peace on the 1st of April. My father attended sober for the only time in my memory. He shook Aldridge's hand and told him I was a good worker. He did not say I was a good daughter. He knew better. I left his house on a Monday morning, carrying my clothes in a flour sack, my mother's wedding ring hidden in my shoe. I did not look back. I walked the 3 blocks to Aldridge's rented room on Jefferson Street, and when I closed the door behind me, I stood with my back against it for several minutes, listening to my own breathing. The silence was absolute. No bellows, no footsteps on the stair, no clink of brass against leather. I did not know what to do with peace. It felt like drowning. Thomas Aldridge was a man of habits. He rose at 6, walked to his office, returned at 6 for his supper. He expected a warm meal, a clean shirt, a wife who did not speak unless spoken to. In this, he was no different from my father, except that he did not drink, and he did not strike me. The absence of violence was not the same as the presence of kindness, but I was grateful for it. I learned his preferences, his routines, his silences. I bore him 2 children in 3 years, Clara, named for my mother in 1864, and Silas, named for my father, though I begged him not to, in 1866. I was 19 years old. I had been married for 3 years. I had not seen my father in 20 months, and then, in the autumn of 1867, Thomas Aldridge contracted typhoid fever from contaminated water at the canal dock and died within a week, leaving me with $23, 2 children under 3, and no means of support. I wrote to my father. I asked for help. He replied that I had made my bed and must lie in it, that he had his own troubles, that I should apply to the county poor farm. I burned the letter. I burned it slowly, feeding it to the stove piece by piece, watching the words curl and blacken. I did not write to him again for 17 years. I became a laundress. There was no other work available to a woman with children and no references. In Dayton, in 1867, the options were sewing, teaching, domestic service, or washing other people's clothes. Sewing required capital for materials and a clientele I did not possess. Teaching required certification I could not obtain without time and money. Domestic service required living in, which meant abandoning my children to the poor farm my father had suggested. So I washed. I rented a room on the canal side of town, smaller than the one I had shared with Aldridge, with no windows and a dirt floor. I paid $4 a month. I bought 2 wash tubs, a washboard, a copper boiler, and a supply of lye soap from a widow who was leaving the trade. I charged 12 cents a dozen for shirts, 8 cents for sheets, 4 cents for stockings. I worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. My hands cracked and bled until they hardened into leather. My back bent. I grew thin, then thinner. But my children ate. They had shoes. They did not know their grandfather's name. Claire was 3 when I began, Silas not yet 2. I kept them beside me in a wooden crate padded with rags, fed them bread soaked in milk, taught them to be silent while I worked. They learned quickly. Children of the poor always learn quickly. By the time Claire was 5, She could sort laundry by fabric and color. By the time Silas was 4, he could carry water from the pump, 2 quarts at a time, spilling only a little. I did not beat them. I swore this oath to myself on the day Thomas Aldrich died, and I kept it. When they disobeyed, I spoke to them. When they failed, I showed them again. I never raised my hand. I never raised my voice. I was trying to prove that humanity could be transmitted through will alone, that the belt stopped with me. In 1870, when I was 22, I saved enough to move to a better room, one with a window and a proper stove. I hired a girl of 14 to watch the children while I delivered laundry, paying her in meals and mending. Her name was Margaret O'Hara, daughter of Irish immigrants who had died in the cholera epidemic of 1866. She was simple-minded, unable to read or write her own name, but she was gentle with my children and asked for nothing I could not give. She stayed with me for 11 years, until her own death from consumption in 1881. I buried her beside Thomas Aldrich in Woodland Cemetery, paying for the plot with 3 months of washing. She had no one else. The 1870s passed in a blur of labor and survival. I remember specific moments with clarity, but the years themselves run together like watercolors left in rain. I remember the Great Fire of 1871, not for the destruction in Chicago, which seemed distant and unreal, but for the price of cotton that doubled overnight, forcing me to charge my customers more and lose a third of them. I remember the panic of 1873, when the banks failed and the canal company reduced wages, and I washed the clothes of men who wept at my table because their wives did not know they had been let go. I remember the centennial celebration of 1876, the fireworks I heard from my room but did not see, working through the evening to finish a rush order for a hotel that paid in advance. I was 30 years old in 1878. My children were 14 and 12. I had not seen my father in 15 years, though I knew from his sister's letters, infrequent, guilty, always asking for money, that he still lived, still drank, still cursed my name when drunk. I had not married again, though I had received 2 proposals. The first was from a widower with 3 children who wanted a housekeeper, not a wife. The second was from a man named Henry Marsh, a carpenter who worked on the canal boats, who offered me kindness and a small savings and no demands upon my children. I refused him. I told myself it was because I could not bear another man's ownership. The truth was simpler. I could not bear the possibility that kindness might prove temporary, that I might learn to trust and then be abandoned again. Better to rely on no one. Better to be the pillar, not the leaning wall. Henry Marsh persisted for 3 years. He came to my room every Sunday with a newspaper, which he read aloud while I worked, and a bag of licorice for the children, which they accepted with the wariness of animals unused to gentleness. He asked me nothing. He demanded nothing. He simply appeared, week after week, until his presence became as expected as the church bells I could hear from across the canal. In 1881, when Margaret O'Hara died and I could not stop weeping, he sat with me through the night and did not speak at all. The next morning I asked him to marry me. He said yes before I finished the question. We were married by the same justice of the peace who had united me with Thomas Aldrich 18 years before. I was 33. Henry was 41. He moved into my room, bringing his tools, his books, his habit of humming while he worked. For the first time in my life, I slept without listening for footsteps. For the first time, I woke to a man who smiled when he saw me. The sensation was so unfamiliar that it took me months to recognize it as safety. Henry Marsh was a good man. I say this without reservation, though I have learned to be reserved in all my judgments. He treated my children as his own, though he never attempted to replace their father, never demanded they call him anything but his name. He taught Silas to use a plane and square, to measure twice and cut once, to take pride in work well done. He taught Clara to read figures, to keep accounts, to understand that a woman's mind was as capable as a man's if given the same education. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He came home every evening at the same hour, his hands smelling of pine and linseed oil. And he talked to me about his day, about politics, about books he had read and wanted me to read. He was the first person who assumed I had thoughts worth hearing. In 1883, I became pregnant. I was 35, older than my mother had been when she died, giving birth to me. The pregnancy was difficult. I bled in the 4th month, again in the 6th. Henry wanted me to rest, to stop working, to let him support us alone. I refused. I had learned that security was an illusion, that men died or disappeared or turned cruel, that I must always have means of my own. I washed clothes until my 7th month, delivered laundry until my 8th. In January of 1884, I gave birth to a daughter, small but living, whom we named Margaret, for the girl who had watched my children. The birth cost me 3 weeks of bed rest and my ability to bear more children. The doctor, a German named Hoffman who had delivered half the canal workers' babies, told me plainly that another pregnancy would kill me. I thanked him for the information and felt nothing but relief. We moved to Albany in 1901. Henry had developed a cough that would not leave him, and the damp air of the canal country seemed to worsen it. A cousin of his, a man we had never met, offered him work in a furniture factory, steady wages, a chance to breathe easier. I was 53. I had lived in Dayton my entire life. I had built my security there, my reputation, my small network of customers who trusted me with their linen. I left it all without hesitation. Henry's health was the only consideration that mattered. We sold what we could not carry, gave away the rest, boarded a train for the first time in my life. I watched Ohio disappear through the window and felt no sorrow. I had learned that places were interchangeable, that home was wherever you managed to survive. Albany was different, colder, hillier. The Hudson River moved with a purpose the Miami Canal had never possessed, carrying ocean ships to the interior, connecting us to a world I had only read about. Henry's cough improved. The furniture factory paid better in canal work, and I found employment as a housekeeper for a widow on State Street, a Mrs. Cornelius Van Rensselaer, whose name meant nothing to me, but whose house contained 12 rooms, 3 servants, and a library of 400 books. I was permitted to borrow from this library. In my first year in Albany, I read more than in the previous 53 years combined. Dickens, Eliot, Stowe, the Brontes. I read them with the hunger of a woman who had been starved, who had not known she was starving. My father died in 1889. His sister wrote to me at the Albany boarding house where we lived before finding our own rooms. The letter took 3 weeks to arrive. She described his final illness, the delirium tremens, the way he called for my mother in his last hours. Not for me. She described the funeral, the small attendance, the debts left unpaid. She asked if I would contribute to a headstone. I sent her $5 and a note that said only, "For my mother, not for him." I did not attend the funeral. I did not mourn. I waited for some emotion to arrive, grief, relief, even the satisfaction of outlasting him, but nothing came. He had been dead to me since 1867. The official confirmation changed nothing, or so I believed. In the years that followed, I found myself speaking of him more often, to Henry, to my daughters, to strangers in the market who asked about my childhood. I spoke of him with a flatness that disguised nothing, that revealed everything. I spoke of the belt, the nightly beatings, the silence I had maintained to survive. I spoke not for sympathy, but for explanation. I wanted people to understand that my hardness was not natural, that I had been made, not born, that the woman who could watch a customer weep over a stained tablecloth without offering comfort had once been a child who wept at every injury. I wanted them to know that I had chosen to remain capable of feeling, that I had not let him turn me to stone, even when stone would have been easier. Henry died in 1912. I was 64. We had been married for 31 years, longer than my mother had lived, longer than my first marriage by decades. His death was not sudden. The cough returned in 1908, worse than before, bringing blood with it. The doctors called it consumption, though they used newer words, tuberculosis, pulmonary phthisis, to disguise the old familiar killer. Henry wasted slowly, methodically, as if he were being erased by an artist dissatisfied with the sketch. He continued to work as long as he could, rising at 5, returning at 6, collapsing into the chair I kept ready for him. I nursed him through the final 2 years, feeding him beef tea and cod liver oil, reading to him when his eyes failed, sleeping on a pallet beside his bed to catch the moments when he woke afraid. He spoke of my father only once, near the end. I had been describing a dream, something foolish about water and flying, and he interrupted me with a question I had not expected. "Did you ever forgive him?" he asked. I thought he meant God or death or his own body for failing him. "Your father," he clarified when I did not answer. "Silas. Did you ever forgive him?" I considered lying. Henry deserved the comfort of believing I had transcended my damage, that love had healed what beatings had broken. But I had promised him honesty years before, and I would not break that promise at the last. "No," I said. "I never forgave him. I never will." Henry nodded. He did not look disappointed. He looked, if anything, relieved. "Good," he whispered. "He did not deserve forgiveness. You deserved not to give it." Then he closed his eyes, and I thought he had fallen asleep. But he spoke once more, so softly I had to lean close to hear. "I have tried to be different. Tell me I was different." "You were different," I said. "You were everything he was not." He died 3 days later in his sleep, holding my hand. I did not weep at the funeral. I had wept enough in private, enough to fill rivers. In public, I maintained the composure he would have expected, the dignity he had taught me I deserved. I buried him in Albany Rural Cemetery on a hill overlooking the Hudson, and I purchased the plot beside his for myself. I have visited it every spring since, not to mourn, but to remind myself that I will join him, that this separation is temporary, that something awaits beyond the labor and the memory of pain. I was alone again, but not as before. My children were grown, established, capable. Clara had married a school teacher, a serious man named Arthur Bennett, who treated her with the respect Henry had modeled. They lived in Syracuse, had 3 children of their own, sent me letters every month that I read and reread until the paper softened. Silas had become a carpenter like Henry, married late to a widow with 2 children, made a life in Schenectady that I visited twice yearly. Margaret, my youngest, had never married. She taught mathematics at a girls' academy in Troy, lived in a boarding house with 3 other teachers, wrote me every Sunday without fail. I was not abandoned. I was not helpless. I had resources, relationships, a purpose. I continued working for Mrs. Van Rensselaer until her death in 1916, then for her daughter, then for no one. I had saved enough to live modestly, to rent a room with a window and a stove, to buy books and occasional tickets to the lecture hall. I joined a society for women's suffrage, though I never marched or spoke publicly. I contributed money, wrote letters to legislators, attended meetings where I sat in the back and listened. The vote came in 1920, when I was 72. I cast my ballot for Warren G. Harding, not from any conviction in his policies, but because he had supported women's rights when it was unpopular, and because his opponent reminded me of my father, handsome, charming, fundamentally hollow. The 1920s passed in a haze of reading and memory. I began in 1924 to write down my recollections. Not for publication, I had no illusions about my literary merit, but for clarity, for the ordering of events that had begun to blur in my mind. I wrote about my mother, about the smithy, about the belt. I wrote about Thomas Aldrich and his brief kindness, about Henry Marsh and his lasting one. I wrote about my children, not as achievements, but as people, distinct and mysterious, whom I had somehow helped shape without fully understanding. I filled 3 notebooks, then 5, then 10. I wrote in the mornings when my hands still obeyed me, and I reread in the evenings, correcting, revising, searching for the truth between the lines I had written too quickly or too slowly. In 1929, the year of the crash, I lost most of my savings. The bank where I had deposited Henry's insurance money, his careful accumulations, failed in October. I received 4 cents on the dollar. At 81, I had to seek employment again. I found work as a companion to an elderly woman, a Mrs. Abigail Frost, who was 89 and blind and required assistance with dressing, eating, the navigation of her large house on Elk Street. She was difficult. She was demanding. She reminded me of my father in her rages, her sudden shifts from charm to cruelty, her assumption that servants were instruments without interior lives. I stayed with her for 6 years, longer than I had stayed with my father, because I needed the money and because I had learned, finally, how to survive difficult people without absorbing their damage. Mrs. Frost died in 1935. She left me $500 in her will, more than she left her nieces, a final gesture of acknowledgement that I had never expected. I used the money to move to a smaller room, to hire a girl to clean and cook, to secure the remaining years of my life against complete dependency. I was 87. My children visited when they could. Clara's husband had died in 1931. She lived now with her eldest daughter in Rochester, and we corresponded weekly. Silas had developed heart trouble, could no longer travel, called me on the telephone every Sunday, a device I still found miraculous. The sound of his voice transmitted through wires strung across the state. Margaret visited most often, every 2 weeks, bringing me books from the library, sitting with me through long afternoons of silence that needed no filling. It was Margaret who arranged for this recording. She had read about the Federal Writers Project, the effort to capture the voices of ordinary Americans before they disappeared. She thought my story worth preserving. I thought it worth nothing, or worth too much, or worth only to me. But I agreed, for her sake, because she had asked so little of me through her life, because I owed her the documentation of what I had survived. I did not know when I spoke into the machine in the autumn of 1938 that these words would outlast me, that strangers would hear my voice long after my body had joined Henry's in the Albany soil. I spoke only to speak, to answer the questions put to me by a young man from New York City who treated me with the deference due my age and the curiosity due my experience. He asked about my father. Of course he asked. It was the central fact of my narrative, the organizing principle of my memory. I told him about the belt. I told him about the nights, the silence, the hatred that had sustained me. I watched him write in his notebook, his pencil moving quickly, and I wondered what he heard. Did he hear tragedy? Did he hear resilience? Did he hear an old woman's bitterness, finally given permission to speak? I did not know. I did not care. I spoke for myself, for the child I had been, for the woman I had become, despite everything. The recording took 3 sessions, spread across 2 weeks. I spoke for hours each time, until my voice grew hoarse, until the young man ran out of cylinders or patience. I told him about Dayton, about the canal, about the wars and panics and migrations. I told him about my husbands, my children, my work. I told him about the books I had read, the votes I had cast, the society I had joined and quietly served, and always returning. I told him about my father, the belt, every night, the sound of the buckle, the weight of the leather, the calculation of survival. He asked me at the end of the final session whether I had any regrets. I considered the question. I had made mistakes. I had been hard when softness was possible, distant when closeness was offered, suspicious of kindness because kindness had so often proven temporary. I had wounded my children with my reserve, my difficulty in expressing affection, my assumption that they knew what I could not say. I had failed to protect them from all pain, though I had tried, though I had sworn to be different from my father. I had lived. That was the only summary possible. I regret, I said slowly, choosing each word with the care of a woman who had learned that words mattered, that I spent so many years hating him. Not because he deserved better. He deserved nothing. But because hatred takes energy, and I had so little to spare. I could have used those years for other purposes. I could have been softer. I could have learned to trust more quickly. I could have enjoyed Henry's love without waiting for its withdrawal. The young man nodded, wrote something I could not see. But you don't regret the hatred itself, he said. It was not a question. No, I agreed. I do not regret the hatred itself. It kept me alive. It gave me reason to leave, to work, to build something he could not touch. I regret only its duration, its completeness, the way it colonized parts of me that might have been otherwise occupied. I was more than his victim. I became more. But I never stopped being his victim, and that is what I regret. Not the fact of it, but the fixation upon it, the inability to fully become otherwise. I am often asked by those who read the transcripts or hear these recordings why I did not leave sooner, why I endured 15 years when escape was possible, when relatives might have taken me in, when the streets of Dayton, however harsh, could not have been worse than the Belt. I understand the question. It is the question of people who have never been broken systematically, who have not learned that the world outside can seem more dangerous than the devil you know. I did not leave because I did not know I could. I did not leave because my father controlled all resources, all knowledge, all access to the world beyond his smithy. I did not leave because I was a child, and children do not leave. They endure, they survive, they wait for rescue or adulthood, whichever comes first. But there is another answer, one I have only recently permitted myself to articulate. I did not leave because some part of me believed I deserved the punishment. This is the cruelest legacy of abuse, the internalization of the abuser's logic. My father told me with every blow that I was wicked, lazy, disobedient, ungrateful. He told me that my mother's death was my fault, that my crying had weakened her, that my existence had shortened her life. I knew intellectually that these were lies. I knew that childbirth killed women regardless of their children's behavior. But knowledge does not protect against belief. Some dark chamber of my heart accepted his verdict. I was bad. The belt was just. If I could only be good enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, the punishment would stop. It never stopped. But I never stopped trying to earn its cessation. I escaped at 21, not because I finally rejected his logic, but because marriage offered a different narrative. Thomas Aldridge did not tell me I was bad. He told me I was useful, which was not love, but was at least not condemnation. I transferred my obedience from one man to another, my worth measured still by my utility, my silence still my greatest virtue. It took Henry to show me that I could be valued for my presence rather than my function, my thoughts rather than my labor. And even with Henry, it took years to believe him, to relax my vigilance, to accept that his kindness would not be suddenly withdrawn as punishment for some undetected failure. This is what I want understood, what I've tried to explain to my children, to Margaret, who records these words, to anyone who will listen. Survival is not a single act. It is not the dramatic escape, the breaking of chains, the declaration of independence. Survival is daily. It is the small choices made in darkness the refusal to surrender entirely, the preservation of some core self that the abuser cannot reach. I survived my father not by defying him, defiance would have killed me, but by dividing myself. There was the Esther who absorbed the blows, who learned to be silent, who performed submission so perfectly that he sometimes forgot to punish. And there was the Esther who read The Pilgrim's Progress by Forge Light, who memorized Miss Bowen's lessons, who promised herself that this was temporary, that a future existed in which she would be free, that inner Esther was the true one. I know this now. She was not a fantasy, not a coping mechanism, but the self I would become, the self I was always meant to be. The beatings shaped her, but did not create her. She existed before them, in my mother's womb perhaps, in some spiritual prehistory I cannot explain. She persisted through them, diminished but intact. She emerged gradually in the years after my escape, claiming territory from the silent, watchful creature I had been forced to become. By the time I met Henry, she was strong enough to recognize her match. By the time he died, she was strong enough to survive his loss. She is speaking now through this aged voice, this failing body. She is the I who refuses to be erased. My father understood none of this. I do not know if he understood anything, if his cruelty was calculated or merely habitual, if he took pleasure in my pain or simply felt nothing at all. He was a mystery to me, even when I lived with him, even when I studied his moods with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. I knew his triggers, noise, expense, any reminder of my mother, but not their origin. I knew his rituals, the drinking, the belt, the sleep that followed, but not their meaning. He never spoke of his own childhood, his own father, the source of whatever damage had been transmitted to him. Perhaps he did not know. Perhaps he knew and could not bear to say. Perhaps he believed, as I briefly believed, that silence was strength, that feeling was weakness, that love was a trap set by women to enslave men. I have tried in these late years to imagine him as a child, small, vulnerable, perhaps beaten himself, perhaps merely neglected, perhaps simply born with some deficiency of spirit that made connection impossible. I've tried to pity him. The effort fails. Pity requires some bridge of common humanity, some recognition of shared vulnerability, and I cannot find it. He burned that bridge himself, night after night, with the leather belt that was his only legacy. I don't hate him now with the active, consuming hatred of my youth. That energy is faded, redirected into living. But I don't forgive him. I will not forgive him. Forgiveness would require me to declare his crimes erased, his debt paid, and they are not. They are mine now, incorporated into my being, transformed into the strength that has carried me through 90 years. I will not surrender them. They are all I have of him, and I have earned them. My children have asked me at various times why I speak of him so often. Why, in the midst of happy occasions, Clara's wedding, the birth of her children, Margaret's graduation from the normal school, I would suddenly mention the belt, the smithy, the nights of my childhood. They found it morbid, they told me, or at least excessive. Could I not let the past rest? Could I not focus on the present, on the family I had made, the life I had built? I tried to explain that he was present in every happiness, shadowing it, defining it by contrast. Every gentle touch from Henry recalled his violence. Every success of my children recalled his prediction that I would come to nothing. I spoke of him because he was there, because ignoring him would not make him disappear, because the only way to diminish his power was to name it repeatedly until the naming became routine, until the routine became boring, until boredom became the closest approximation to peace I could achieve. I'm closer to that peace now than I have ever been, not because I have forgiven, not because I have forgotten, but because I have outlasted. He has been dead for 49 years. I have lived without him for 71. The proportions have shifted. He occupies less of my life with each passing year, less of my thoughts, less of my emotional landscape. What remains is not him, but my response to him, the habits of vigilance and self-reliance that once were necessary and now are merely characteristic. I am who I became because of him, but I am no longer defined by that becoming. The belt shaped me, but it does not name me. I name myself here, in these final years, with whatever voice remains to me. The years between my father's death and Henry's were the most peaceful I have known. I was 41 when Silas Whitfield finally drank himself into the grave, 64 when Henry followed him. Those 23 years formed an island in my life, a country with its own climate and customs, separated from what came before and what came after by waters of different temperatures. I lived there. I grew there. I became finally the person I might have been without the belt, or as close to that person as damage permits. I did not attend my father's funeral, but I attended to his effects. His sister, my Aunt Judith, wrote to me of debts, of creditors circling the smithy like crows, of a house filled with objects no one wanted. She could not manage it alone. She was 70, unmarried, dependent on the charity of cousins who had their own concerns. I went to Dayton in November of 1889, traveling by train with a reluctance I could not explain to Henry, who offered to accompany me. I refused. This was something I needed to do alone, to see the place of my childhood with eyes that had learned to see differently, to confirm that it was smaller than memory made it, that he was smaller, that I had grown beyond the dimensions of his cruelty. The smithy was smaller. The rooms above it were smaller. The bed where my mother died and where I had been beaten was narrow and short, built for people of lesser stature than modern Americans. I stood in the doorway of that room for several minutes, waiting for something to happen. Tears, rage, collapse. Nothing happened. The room was a room. The bed was a bed. The scratches on the doorframe where I had marked my height in pencil were still visible, my name in childish letters, the dates blurred but legible. I had been tall for my age. I had been strong. I had survived in this space, and now it could not touch me. I sold everything. The smithy to a younger man who would convert it to a machine shop. The house to a developer who would tear it down for a boarding house. The tools, the furniture, the accumulation of 40 years of living. I kept only 3 items. My mother's wedding ring, which had been hidden in my shoe when I left, the copy of the Pilgrim's Progress that Miss Bowen had given me, its pages soft with handling, and the belt. Yes, the belt. It hung still on its peg by the door, dried and cracked with age, the brass buckle tarnished green. I took it down. I folded it. I packed it in my trunk between layers of clothing, and I carried it back to Albany. Henry never asked why. He saw me unpack it, saw me place it in the bottom drawer of my bureau beneath my underclothes, and he said nothing. He understood, I believe, that some objects must be kept to be mastered, that possession can be a form of exorcism. I kept it for 20 years. I took it out occasionally when Henry was not home, and I held it in my hands, feeling its weight, its flexibility, its capacity for pain. I never used it. I never struck anything with it, never even snapped it in anger. I simply held it, reminding myself that it was inanimate, that its power derived entirely from the hand that wielded it, that my father's hand was dust, and his power over me was dust with him. In 1909, the year after Henry's cough returned, I burned it. I did not plan to. I opened the drawer to retrieve a handkerchief, and I saw it there, and I was suddenly, overwhelmingly tired of its presence. I built a fire in the stove, though it was September and not cold, and I fed the belt to it piece by piece, as I had fed my father's letter 20 years before. The leather smoked and stank. The buckle I saved, cooling it in water, then wrapping it in cloth and burying it in the garden beneath the rose bush Henry had planted for me. It is there still, I assume, unless someone has dug it up, wondered at it, discarded it, a brass buckle in the dirt, no story attached, no meaning. This is what I wanted for it. This is what I achieved. The work I did in those years, between 41 and 64, was the work of becoming visible. I had spent my first 4 decades trying to be invisible, to attract no attention, to provoke no punishment. Now I practiced presence. I spoke in meetings, initially with my heart pounding so violently I could hear it, later with something approaching calm. I wrote letters to newspapers using my initials rather than my full name, arguing for women's rights, for labor protections, for the education of the poor. I was published twice, brief letters among dozens, but I saw my words in print, my thoughts distributed, my existence confirmed by the medium that had always seemed to me the highest form of magic. I traveled, not far, not extravagantly, but deliberately, to Boston in 1895, to hear Elizabeth Cady Stanton speak at the suffrage convention. She was 80, magnificent, unrepentant. I sat in the balcony and wept without knowing why. Tears of recognition, of solidarity, of grief for all the years I had not known such women existed. To New York City in 1898, to see the harbor, the buildings that touched the sky, the crowds that made Albany seem a village. I was 50, traveling alone, staying in a hotel that catered to women, walking the streets with a map and a determination not to appear lost. I was not lost. I was found. I was finding myself in every new vista, every unfamiliar sound, every conversation with strangers who did not know my history and judged me only by my present self. I developed opinions. This sounds simple, but for a woman raised in silence, trained in obedience, opinions are acts of rebellion. I believed in the single tax after reading Henry George. I believed in the 8-hour day after watching Henry come home too tired to speak. I believed in cremation rather than burial, in birth control rather than endless childbearing, in divorce as a necessary evil rather than a sin. I argued these positions at dinner parties, in letters, in the suffrage society meetings where women of my age and class gathered to remake the world. Not all my beliefs survived the century. Some I modified, some abandoned, some saw fulfilled in ways I had not anticipated. But the having of them, the stating of them, the willingness to be wrong and to learn, this was my victory. This was the self that had read by Forge Light, finally given voice and audience. Henry encouraged all of it. He bought me books I mentioned wanting, saved articles he thought would interest me, listened to my accounts of meetings and debates with genuine attention. He did not always agree. We argued civilly about tariffs and currency and the proper role of government in private life. These arguments were themselves a gift, the proof that we were equals, that our marriage was a partnership rather than a hierarchy. I had not known this was possible. I had not known that disagreement could coexist with love, that independence could strengthen rather than threaten connection. Every year with Henry taught me something my father had suppressed, that I was a person, full and complete, worthy of space and voice and consideration. I tried in those years to find my mother's family, the Dennisons of Dayton, or wherever they had come from. My Aunt Judith knew little. My father had discouraged contact, and my mother had been too young, too quickly dead, to establish her own networks. I wrote letters, placed advertisements in newspapers, visited cemeteries to read headstones. I found nothing definite. A Dennison family in Indiana who might have been related, who answered my inquiry with polite confusion. A Clara Dennison born in 1820 in Pennsylvania, dead in infancy. The trail went cold, as trails do when the people who maintained them disappear. I stopped searching after Henry's death. It seemed less urgent then, the need for ancestry, for the validation of blood. I had made my own family, chosen my own connections, built my own lineage of care and survival. This is what I want to emphasize, what I fear the recording of my father's crimes obscures. I was not merely his victim. I was not merely the woman who survived the belt. I was a citizen, a reader, a writer, a traveler, a thinker, a wife who loved and was loved, a mother who raised children without violence, a friend to women and men who valued my company. I existed in dimensions he never imagined, never controlled, never touched. The belt was real. The damage was real. But it was not the whole of me. It was not even the largest part. It was the darkness against which I defined my light, the compression that forced my growth in unexpected directions. I would not thank him for it. I do not bless the trauma, but I claim the result. I am who I became, and I have learned, finally, to be proud of her. There is a particular silence that comes at the end of a life, when the noise of activity has diminished, and all that remains is the sorting of what has been. I live in that silence now. My children visit, but they have their own lives, their own preoccupations, their own children and grandchildren who know me only as a name, a face in a photograph, a voice on a recording they may never hear. I do not resent this. It is the natural order, the way of generations, that the old retreat to make space for the young. But I do observe it. I note the shift in attention, the way Clara's eyes move to the clock, the way Silas's hand finds his chest when his heart troubles him, the way Margaret, faithful Margaret, begins to show the fatigue of caring for a woman who has lived too long. I have lived too long. This is not self-pity. It is assessment. I have outlived my usefulness in any conventional sense. I cannot work, cannot travel, cannot even climb the stairs to my room without assistance. I exist in a narrowing circle of capability, my world reduced to this chair, this window, this view of the street where people walk, with purposes I can no longer share. I read, but with difficulty, the letters swimming and rearranging themselves on the page. I write, but slowly, my hand cramping after minutes of effort. I think, but thinking too leads to fatigue, to the need for sleep that does not refresh, to dreams that confuse past and present until I wake uncertain of my age, my location, whether Henry is alive or dead, whether my father waits on the stair. The confusion frightens me, not death. I have made my peace with death, have purchased my plot, have instructed my children on my preferences for disposal, but the dissolution of self that precedes it. I've been so careful, so deliberate in constructing this identity. Esther May Whitfield, survivor, witness, voice. To lose that construction, to become merely a body requiring care, a mouth to be fed, a confusion to be managed, seems a betrayal of everything I have built. I want to end with clarity. I want my last words, whenever they come, to be intentional, meaningful, true to the self I have struggled to become. This recording is part of that intention. These words will survive whatever confusion claims my final months. I've been thinking in these long hours of sitting about the women I knew who did not survive. My mother, of course, first and always, dead at 26 with her life unlived, her potential unrealized, but others too. The women whose laundry I washed, some of them younger than I, dead of childbirth, of fever, of cancers that consumed them in months. The women in the poor farm, whose names I never learned, whose faces blur together into a composite of need and resignation. The women in the suffrage society, brilliant, passionate, some of them dead now, their victories partial, their struggles ongoing. I think of them as a choir, a multitude of voices that never had the chance to speak, or spoke and were not heard, or spoke and were punished for speaking. I am their representative. I am their survivor. This is not arrogance. It is responsibility. I've tried to teach this responsibility to my daughters, though I fear I have taught it more by example than by explanation. Clara has absorbed it, I believe, in her own way. She is softer than I, more trusting, more willing to believe in the goodness of institutions, of people, of the future. But she votes. She works for causes. She raised her daughters to expect education, independence, respect. Margaret learned differently. She learned my hardness, my self-sufficiency, my suspicion of easy answers. She never married, never placed herself in the power of another, never risked the vulnerability that love requires. I watch her sometimes and see myself, the self I might have been without Henry, without the proof that trust could be rewarded. I do not know if I failed her by example, or if she chose her own path, or if the distinction matters. She is happy, I think, in her way. She is certainly capable. She will survive my death as I survived my mother's, with grief but with resources, with loss but with purpose. My son is another matter, Silas carries wounds I did not inflict but could not prevent. He saw too much in his early years of my struggle. He felt too strongly the absence of a father, the weight of being the only male in a household of women, the confusion of loving a mother who was sometimes distant, sometimes overwhelming in her need for him to succeed, to be strong, to make her sacrifices worthwhile. I tried to tell him that my sacrifices were my own choice, that he owed me nothing, that his life belonged to him. I do not know if he believed me. He is a good man, a good father, but there is a sadness in him that I have never been able to reach, a sense of insufficiency that no success dispels. Perhaps this is simply the human condition. Perhaps I blame myself too easily. Perhaps he would have been sad regardless of my mothering, regardless of the belt that shaped me and therefore shaped my shaping of him. I have not spoken in these recordings of my physical decline. It seems important now to acknowledge it, to include the body in this testimony and not merely the mind. I am 90. My joints ache with a constancy that has become background noise, like the bellows of my father's forge, present, but no longer fully noticed. My digestion has become unpredictable, my appetite diminished, my sleep fragmented into segments of waking and dozing that no longer correspond to day and night. I have lost teeth, hair, the elasticity of skin, the sharpness of hearing, the reliability of balance. I have fallen twice, once cracking a rib that still pains me in weather changes. I have seen doctors who offer no cure, only management, only the postponement of the inevitable. The inevitable does not frighten me. I have lived with death my entire life. I watched my mother die, my husbands die, my friends and acquaintances and enemies die. I have buried children, the cruelest experience, the one that no parent should survive, but many must. I have prepared myself. I have made my arrangements, written my instructions, said my goodbyes in the form of letters to be opened later, gifts distributed now, conversations that attempt to transmit what wisdom I have accumulated. I do not know if wisdom is transmissible. I suspect each generation must learn its own lessons, make its own mistakes, suffer its own belts. But I have tried. I have made the attempt. That is all any of us can do. What I want to leave, what I want to survive, this voice in these words, is not the story of victimhood. Let others tell that story. Analyze it. Theorize about the effects of childhood trauma on adult personality. I want to leave the story of becoming. The story of a girl who was hit and who learned eventually to stop flinching, who was silenced and who learned eventually to speak, who was told she was worthless and who learned eventually to value herself. This learning took decades. It was not a single revelation, but a slow accumulation of evidence, of experiences that contradicted my father's verdict, of people who treated me as if I mattered until I began to believe them. Henry mattered most in this education, but others contributed. Miss Bowen with her book, Margaret O'Hara with her simple loyalty, the women in the suffrage society with their fierce conviction, my children with their existence, their needs, their love. I am still learning. At 90, I am still learning. Learning to accept help without shame. Learning to be silent without being frightened. Learning to let go of the hatred that has sustained me, not by forgiving, but by outlasting, by making it irrelevant to my present existence. The belt is ash. The buckle is buried. The house is sold, the smithy demolished, the street renamed and renumbered until no trace remains of where I suffered. Only I remain. Only this voice, these words, this final attempt to explain what cannot be fully explained, only witnessed. I've hated my father for 84 years. I've carried him with me longer than my mother, longer than my husband's, longer than any friend or enemy or passing acquaintance. He has been the constant companion of my consciousness, the shadow in every room, the weight in every calculation of worth. I am tired of him. I am tired of the space he occupies, the energy he consumes, the return he demands on an investment of pain that should have depreciated to nothing decades ago. But I don't know how to release him. I do not know if release is possible or desirable, or merely another form of self-deception. So I continue to carry him. I continue to name him. I continue to place him at the center of this narrative, as he placed himself at the center of my childhood. And I wait for the day when his name will be the last thing I forget, or the first, or simply another sound without meaning, like the wind, like the sea, like the silence that waits beyond these words. My name is Esther May Whitfield. I was born in Dayton, Ohio on the 3rd day of November in the year 1848. I have stated this before. I state it again because it is the fact from which all other facts proceed, the fixed point in a life of motion and change. I am Esther May Whitfield. I was born. I survived. I speak. I do not know how much longer I will speak. The young man from the Federal Writers Project has returned to New York with his cylinders and his transcripts. Margaret tells me they will be stored in Washington, in a building called the Library of Congress, alongside the testimonies of others like me, ordinary people made extraordinary only by the fact of being heard. I do not expect to be remembered. I do not expect to be studied, quoted, celebrated. I expect these words to molder in their archives, to be discovered by some researcher decades hence, to be read with the curiosity one brings to any artifact from a lost time. This is enough. This is more than I expected. To have spoken, to have been recorded, to have placed my voice in the stream of history. This is immortality enough for a laundress, a widow, a woman who was never supposed to matter. I have tried to explain why I hated my father. I do not know if I have succeeded. The explanation is simple in its facts. The belt, every night, for 15 years. It is complex in its effects. The silence I learned, the vigilance I maintained, the hatred that became my fuel in my prison. I hated him because he hurt me. I hated him because he made me afraid. I hated him because he took my mother from me, first by his neglect, then by his violence, finally by his mere existence which overshadowed her memory. I hated him because he was weak and pretended strength, because he was cruel and called it discipline, because he was drunk and called it necessity. I hated him because hating him was the only power available to me, the only refusal I could make, the only self I could preserve against his attempts to break me. I do not hate him now with the same intensity. Time has diluted the emotion as water dilutes ink, leaving only the stain, the residue, the knowledge of what was once dark and concentrated. But I have not forgiven him. I will not forgive him. Forgiveness would require me to declare his crimes acceptable, his debt paid, his memory washed clean. They are not acceptable. The debt is not paid. His memory is what I say it is, a caution, a negative example, a man who had every opportunity to be decent and chose, repeatedly, to be otherwise. I don't wish him in hell. I don't wish him anywhere. I wish him forgotten. And since I cannot forget him, I settle for naming him, for placing him in his proper proportion. One man, one life, one series of choices that affected me deeply but did not, finally, define me. I define myself. This is the truth I want to end with. Not the truth of victimhood, though I was a victim. Not the truth of survival, though I survived. The truth of self-creation, of the person I made from the materials available, the damaged child and the struggling young woman and the weary middle-aged wife and the elderly widow who speaks these words. I made Esther May Whitfield. I made her with help from Henry, from my children, from books and friends and the slow accumulation of years, but I made her. She did not emerge fully formed. She was forged, like my father's iron, in heat and pressure, shaped by tools that left their marks. But she holds, she stands, she speaks. I have no religion to offer, no consolation of heaven or threat of hell. I do not know what comes after death. I expect nothing, which means I am prepared for anything. If there is judgment, I will face it with the same composure I have tried to maintain in life. If there is oblivion, I will not know it, and therefore will not mind it. If there is something else, some continuation of consciousness in a form I cannot imagine, I will adapt to it as I have adapted to every other change. Adaptation has been my skill. Survival has been my vocation. I have practiced both for 90 years. I leave nothing of material value. My savings are modest, my possessions few. I leave these words, which are everything I have to give, the distillation of a life spent learning to speak after years of enforced silence. I leave my children, who carry my genes and my example, for better and for worse. I leave my grandchildren, who will remember me dimly, if at all, as an old woman in a chair, a voice on a recording, a name in a family Bible. This is the fate of most of us, to be remembered briefly and then forgotten, to be replaced by those who will themselves be replaced. I do not resent it. I am part of a chain, a connection between what was and what will be, and the chain does not require individual links to be permanent, only to hold for their allotted span. I held. For 90 years I held. Through the belt and the silence, through the widowhood and the labor, through the love and the loss, and the long, slow decline into this chair, this window, this final solitude. I held myself, my name, my voice. I refused to be erased. I refused to be turned to stone. I remained capable of love, though love had been dangerous. I remained capable of trust, though trust had been betrayed. I remained capable of hope, though hope had been disappointed. These capacities were my victory, greater than any public achievement, more lasting than any monument. I remained human. In the face of everything that conspired to make me otherwise, I remained human. The belt is ash, the buckle is buried, the house is gone, the smithy is gone. My father is gone, and I will soon follow him. But I have spoken. I have named what was done to me and what I did with it. I have testified. This is my explanation. This is my legacy. The belt. Every night. Until I escaped, and after the escape, the long, slow work of becoming someone who no longer needed to run, who could stand still, who could speak these words without flinching, without weeping, without hate. I am Esther May Whitfield. I was born in 1848. I will die when I die. Between those dates, I lived. Not happily, not always, not without damage, but fully, consciously, deliberately. I lived, and now I am done.